The moment they clapped for her, I realized I had already disappeared. The skyline of Manhattan shimmered like glass under the late summer heat, every building reflecting a version of a life I thought I was about to step into. And for a second I just stood there at the edge of the rooftop, clutching the thin strap of my bag, still wearing the blazer I had rushed out in after coordinating the final details of an event that cost more than my parents' house in Ohio. And I remember thinking how ironic it was that I had planned every inch of this night down to the placement of each champagne flute, yet somehow I was the only thing that didn't belong in it anymore, because when I finally pushed through the crowd, weaving past men in tailored suits and women who smelled like money and certainty, I saw Daniel standing under the soft glow of string lights, smiling that practiced, effortless smile I had memorized over 3 years. But the hand he was holding wasn't mine, and the ring catching the light wasn't meant for her finger, and for a second my brain refused to process what my eyes were clearly telling me, like reality had glitched in front of me, because Vanessa, my older sister, the one who always walked into rooms like she owned them, was standing in my place, her posture flawless, her smile calm, her hand lifted just enough for everyone to admire the diamond that should have been mine, and the crowd responded exactly how it was supposed to, soft gasps, then applause, phones rising into the air to capture the moment. And I stood there, 5 feet away, invisible in a room I had built, feeling the sound of clapping press against my chest like something heavy and suffocating. And I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't even move, because something colder settled inside me, something quieter, like a switch flipping off, and I remember noticing small things instead. The way Daniel avoided looking directly at me even as he pulled Vanessa closer, the way my mother's hand rested lightly on Vanessa's back as if guiding her into the role she had always wanted her to play, the way my father nodded slightly, approving, as if this had all been discussed and agreed upon long before I ever walked into the room, and that was the moment it hit me, not as a shock but as a slow, precise realization, that I hadn't just lost him. I had been replaced carefully, deliberately, like a detail corrected in a plan that no longer needed me, and I could hear my own voice in my head, steady, detached, almost amused at how cleanly it had all unfolded, how perfectly timed it was that I had been busy working while they rewrote my life without me. And when Vanessa finally turned her head and saw me standing there, her expression didn't change, not even a flicker of guilt or hesitation, just that same composed smile as she stepped forward, closing the distance between us in 3 effortless steps, leaning in like she was about to hug me. Like this was still a celebration we were both part of, and she whispered softly, her voice warm enough for anyone watching but sharp enough for only me to understand. You were never built for this life. And I felt something settle into place inside my chest. Not heartbreak, not anger, something quieter and more permanent, like a decision forming before I even fully understood it, and I stepped back just slightly, enough to create space between us, enough to see the entire scene clearly for what it was, the skyline, the lights, the applause, the man I thought I loved, the sister who had taken my place, and for the first time that night I smiled, not because I was okay, but because I finally understood something they didn't, that if they could replace me this easily, then maybe I had been standing in the wrong life all along. No one tells you that betrayal is quiet, that it sounds less like a scream and more like applause fading behind you. I do not remember walking out of the party, but I remember the elevator doors closing, the mirrored walls reflecting a version of me that looked perfectly composed, hair still in place, makeup untouched, like nothing had happened, like I had not just watched my life get reassigned in front of 200 people who would talk about it over brunch the next morning. And I remember staring at my own reflection and wondering when exactly I had become someone so easy to replace. Because that was the part that stayed with me, not the ring, not Daniel, not even Vanessa, but the way no one hesitated, not even for a second, like this had always been the better version of the story. And I pressed the lobby button without thinking, my finger steady even though everything inside me felt strangely hollow, like the impact had already passed and all that was left was the echo. And when the doors opened to the marble lobby, the air felt colder, quieter, like the world outside the rooftop did not care what had just happened upstairs. And maybe that was the worst part, how normal everything still was. The doorman nodding politely, a couple laughing as they crossed the floor, a woman adjusting her heels near the entrance, life continuing as if I had not just been erased from it. And I stepped outside onto the street, the city wrapping around me in its usual rhythm, taxis moving, headlights streaking across the pavement, the distant hum of traffic blending into something almost comforting. And for a moment I just stood there on the sidewalk, still holding my phone, still wearing the event badge clipped to my blazer, the one that labeled me as the planner, the organizer, the person behind the night, and I realized how fitting that was, that I had built the entire stage and still ended up backstage in my own story. And my phone buzzed in my hand once, then again, and I did not need to look to know who it was, but I did anyway, because part of me wanted confirmation, wanted something clear and undeniable, and there it was, Vanessa's name lighting up the screen, followed by a message that read, "Please do not make this harder than it has to be." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly her, controlled, polished, already framing the narrative in a way that made her the reasonable one. The one who had made the difficult but necessary choice, and I typed nothing back, just stared at the words until the screen dimmed, and then another message appeared, this time from my mother, shorter, colder. "Come home tomorrow. We need to talk." And I knew exactly what that meant, not comfort, not support, but explanation, justification, a carefully constructed version of events where this outcome made sense, where I would be expected to understand, to accept, to step aside. Gracefully like I always had, and something inside me resisted that, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet refusal to play the role they had already written for me. And I slipped my phone into my bag, finally unclipping the event badge and holding it in my hand for a second before dropping it into the nearest trash can, watching it disappear beneath a layer of paper cups and receipts. And it felt symbolic in a way I could not fully explain, like I was discarding more than just a piece of plastic, like I was letting go of a version of myself that had spent too long trying to fit into spaces that were never really mine, and I started walking without a destination, heels clicking against the pavement in a steady rhythm, each step pulling me further away from the life I thought I had, and the city stretched out in front of me, wide and indifferent and full of possibilities that had nothing to do with Daniel or Vanessa or the expectations I had been carrying for years. And somewhere, between one block and the next, the numbness shifted into something sharper. Not pain exactly, but clarity, and a thought surfaced, simple and undeniable. If they could replace me that easily, then I had nothing left to lose, and for the first time that night that felt like freedom. Freedom does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like standing in the middle of nowhere with nothing left to hold on to. I did not stop walking until the lights of Midtown blurred into something quieter, something less polished, where the sidewalks were uneven and the storefronts did not try so hard to impress anyone. And I ended up somewhere in the Lower East Side without planning to, the kind of place where people minded their own business and no one looked twice at a woman still dressed like she had just stepped out of a rooftop engagement party that no longer belonged to her. And my feet ached, but I did not slow down, because if I stopped, I was afraid everything I had been holding back would finally catch up to me, and I was not ready for that, not yet, so I kept moving until a flickering neon sign caught my attention, a bar wedged between a laundromat and a closed deli, the kind of place I would never have stepped into before, not because it was dangerous but because it did not fit into the version of my life I had been trying to build, and that realization alone was enough to make me push the door open and step inside, the air warmer than outside, carrying the faint smell of coffee and something fried, the lighting dim but honest, no pretension, no performance, just a handful of people scattered across worn stools and small tables, and for the first time that night, no one recognized me, no one knew who I was supposed to be, and that felt strangely comforting, like I had finally slipped out of the script everyone else had been reading from, and I walked to the bar without hesitation, ignoring the curious glance from the bartender as I slid onto a stool, my heels clicking softly against the metal footrest, and I ordered something simple, not because I wanted it but because I needed something to do with my hands, something to anchor me in the moment. And that was when I noticed him, not because he was trying to be noticed, but because he was the only person in the room who seemed completely still, sitting a few seats away, his posture relaxed but alert, like someone who observed more than he spoke, and there was nothing flashy about him, no expensive watch, no tailored suit, just a plain dark jacket and a quiet presence that did not demand attention but somehow held it anyway, and I found myself watching him for a second longer than necessary, trying to understand why he felt different from everyone else in the room, and when he finally looked up, our eyes met in a way that felt deliberate, not accidental, like he had already been aware of me before I even noticed him, and I should have looked away, I should have minded my own business, but something in me had already crossed a line I could not uncross, something that had started the moment I walked out of that rooftop and into a version of the night that no longer followed the rules I had lived by, and before I could think myself out of it, I stood up, took my glass with me, and moved to the empty seat across from him, ignoring the way the bartender paused mid-motion as if he expected me to reconsider, and I sat down, placing the glass carefully on the table between us, my hand steady even though everything inside me felt like it was balancing on the edge of something irreversible. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional. And then I heard my own voice, calm, controlled, almost detached from the weight of what I was about to say. "I need to get married tonight." And the words hung in the air between us, absurd and completely serious at the same time, and he did not laugh, he did not question my sanity, he just watched me, really watched me, like he was measuring something beyond the surface, and I could feel it, that quiet assessment, not judgmental, not curious in the way most people would be, but precise, like he was deciding whether I meant it or not, and I held his gaze without looking away, because for the first time that night, I did mean something completely, fully, without hesitation, and after a moment, he leaned back slightly, his expression unchanged, and said, "That is not a reaction, that is a decision." And I felt something shift in the space between us, something that made it clear this was no longer just an impulsive statement thrown into the air. This was something real now, something that could actually happen, and I nodded once, slow and certain. "Then it is a decision," and for the first time since the night began, I felt something close to control return to me, not over what had happened, but over what would happen next. The most dangerous decisions are the ones that feel calm. He did not react the way anyone else would have, no disbelief, no amusement, no attempt to talk me out of it, just that same steady gaze as if he had been waiting for something like this to happen. And for a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake, not because of what I said but because of who I had said it to, because there was something about him that did not match the simplicity of this place, something controlled beneath the surface that made the air between us feel sharper, more deliberate, and yet I did not pull back, I did not correct myself. I simply held his gaze and waited, and after a few seconds he reached into his jacket, not quickly, not cautiously, just with quiet certainty, and placed a folded bill on the table before standing. His movements precise, unhurried, like he had already decided something I had not yet fully understood, and he said, "Then do not waste time," and started walking toward the door without checking if I would follow, and that should have been my moment to stop, to reconsider, to remind myself that I did not know this man, that this was not how rational decisions were made, but something in the way he moved, in the way he did not look back, made it clear that hesitation was not part of whatever this was, and before I could think myself into staying, I was already on my feet, already following him out into the night, the cool air hitting my skin as the door closed behind us, the city quieter now but still alive, headlights passing, distant voices echoing down the street. And he did not ask me anything as we walked, not my name, not my reason, not even confirmation that I was serious, just a simple shift of direction toward the curb where a car was already waiting, dark, unremarkable, blending into the street like it belonged there. And that was the first moment I felt it, that subtle shift from coincidence to something more intentional, but I ignored it because I had already stepped too far forward to pretend this was still just impulse, and I slid into the passenger seat. Without question, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and the car moved almost immediately, merging into traffic without hesitation. And for a few minutes there was nothing but the quiet hum of the engine and the faint glow of streetlights passing through the windows, and then he finally spoke, his voice low even. "You understand this does not undo what happened tonight," and I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite relief, just acknowledgement. "I am not trying to undo it," I said, my voice steady. "I am trying to make sure it does not define what comes next." And he glanced at me then, briefly, just long enough to register something I could not fully read before. Looking back at the road ahead, and we drove across the bridge into Brooklyn, the skyline shifting behind us, Manhattan fading into the distance as if it belonged to another version of me entirely. And when we stopped in front of a small courthouse building, the kind that stayed open late for paperwork and civil filings, I felt that same calm settle over me again, that strange clarity that had followed me since I walked out of that rooftop, and we stepped inside, the fluorescent lights harsh, but grounding, a clerk behind the counter barely looking up as we approached, and everything moved quickly after that. Forms filled out, signatures placed, questions asked in a routine tone that made this feel like any other legal process, except it was not, because when I signed my name it was not just ink on paper, it was a line I was crossing without any intention of going back. And when it was his turn, He signed just as steadily, no hesitation, no pause, and when the clerk finally looked up to confirm, asking if we both understood what we were agreeing to, I met his eyes again, and for a second the world narrowed down to that single moment, that silent confirmation between two people who had chosen something irreversible without needing to explain it, and I nodded once, yes. And that was it, no ceremony, no witnesses, no celebration, just a quiet legal binding that felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that night. And when we stepped back outside, the air, colder now, sharper, he looked at me for a moment before speaking again. Once you step into this, there is no halfway. And I did not ask what he meant, because something told me I would find out soon enough, and instead I answered the only way that made sense. I am not here for halfway. And for the first time, I saw the faintest shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something close, something that made it clear that whatever I had just walked into, it was not random, and it was not small. Some places do not look dangerous until you realize how quiet they are. The drive felt shorter than it should have been, maybe because my mind had not fully caught up with what I had just done, or maybe because the man sitting beside me carried a kind of silence that made time move differently. But when the car finally stopped, I noticed immediately that we were no longer anywhere near the parts of the city I recognized, and yet it did not feel unfamiliar, just removed, like a version of New York that existed parallel to everything else, quieter, more controlled, and when I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the first thing I noticed was how clean everything was, not in a polished, expensive way, but in a deliberate one, like nothing here was left to chance, and the townhouse in front of us looked almost ordinary at first glance, 3 stories, muted brick, narrow windows, the kind of place you would walk past without thinking twice. But the longer I looked, the more something felt off, not wrong exactly, just precise, like every detail had been measured and adjusted to appear unremarkable. And he unlocked the door without a word, stepping inside as if this was simply the next logical step in a sequence I had already agreed to, and I followed, closing the door behind me, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the stillness of the space, and inside, the house was exactly what I expected and nothing like it at the same time. Minimal furniture, neutral tones, no personal clutter, no photographs, nothing that suggested history or attachment, just a space that existed for function rather than comfort, and I found myself standing in the entryway for a moment longer than necessary, taking it in, trying to reconcile the simplicity of it with the weight of the decision I had just made. And he moved past me with the same quiet certainty, setting his keys down in the same exact spot as if they always belonged there. And for the first time since we left the courthouse, I spoke without thinking, "You live here alone." And it was not a question, just an observation, and he nodded once, "Yes," before adding, "You will have the upstairs room," like it was already decided, like there was no need to discuss it, and I should have questioned that, should have asked what exactly this arrangement was supposed to look like. But instead I just nodded back, because something about the way he spoke made everything feel settled before it was even explained, and I walked up the narrow staircase, my hand trailing lightly along the railing, noticing how clean it was, how untouched, and when I reached the room at the end of the hall, I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting something unexpected. Something that would confirm that this entire situation was as unstable as it should have been. But the room was simple, almost deliberately so. A bed, a dresser, a window overlooking the street, nothing more, and I stepped inside, setting my bag down on the edge of the bed, the quiet pressing in around me in a way that was not uncomfortable but not entirely safe either, like the calm before something I could not yet see, and I moved toward the window, looking down at the street below, noticing the way a black SUV idled briefly across the road before continuing on, the way a man walking his dog slowed slightly as he passed the house, glancing up for just a second too long, and I felt it again, that subtle shift in awareness, like I was standing inside something structured, something observed, even if I did not yet understand it. And when I turned back toward the door, he was standing there, not close, not imposing, just present. And I had not even heard him come up the stairs, which should have unsettled me more than it did. But instead it only reinforced the same thought that had been forming since the bar, that this was not random, that nothing about him was accidental, and he looked at me for a moment before speaking, his tone unchanged. "You can leave at any time," and the words should have reassured me, should have given me an exit, but something about the way he said it made it feel less like freedom and more like a statement of fact, like leaving was an option that existed in theory but not in the way I understood it, and I held his gaze for a second before answering, "I did not come here to leave." And for the first time since the night began, I realized that I meant it, not because I trusted him, not because I understood what I had stepped into, but because whatever this was, it was already more real than the life I had just walked away from, and somewhere deep inside that realization, something quiet and irreversible began to take shape. The truth does not arrive loudly. It waits until you are quiet enough to notice what does not belong. I woke up earlier than I expected, not because of noise but because of the absence of it, the kind of silence that feels structured rather than natural, like the house itself was holding its breath, and for a moment I just lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the exact point where my life had shifted from predictable to something I could not yet define. And then it all came back, the rooftop, the ring, the courthouse, the man downstairs who had become my husband without ever asking me why, and instead of panic, what I felt was something slower, more deliberate, like my mind was adjusting to a new set of rules it had not been given yet. And I got up, moving quietly through the room, noticing again how everything was exactly where it should be, untouched, as if the space had been waiting rather than lived in. And when I stepped into the hallway, the house felt even more still than before, no sound from downstairs, no sign of movement, just that same controlled quiet that made every step feel louder than it was. And I made my way down, my hand brushing lightly against the wall as if grounding myself in something physical. And when I reached the kitchen, it was empty, but not in a way that suggested absence, more like a pause, like something had just happened or was about to. And I noticed a cup of coffee already prepared on the counter, still warm, placed precisely in the center, and I stood there for a second, staring at it because I knew I had not made it, and there was no note, no explanation, just that quiet implication that someone had anticipated I would be there. And I picked it up slowly, taking a small sip, the warmth grounding in a way I had not expected. And that was when I heard it, a faint sound from somewhere deeper in the house, not loud enough to alarm, just enough to draw attention, like something mechanical shifting, and I set the cup down, following the sound without fully thinking it through, moving past the living room, past a hallway I had not noticed the night before until I reached a door at the end, different from the others, not because it looked unusual, but because it felt deliberate, like it was meant to be overlooked, and I hesitated for a second, not out of fear but out of awareness, because something told me that whatever was behind that door would change how I saw everything else. And for a brief moment I considered walking away, leaving it closed, preserving the fragile balance I still had, but that thought passed almost immediately, replaced by the same clarity that had driven every decision since the night before. And I reached for the handle, turning it slowly, the door opening without resistance, and what I saw inside did not register all at once. It came in pieces, a desk, multiple screens, maps spread across the wall marked with lines and symbols I did not understand, stacks of neatly organized cash, banded and sealed, more money than I had ever seen in one place, and phones, several of them identical, lined up with precision, and for a moment I just stood there, trying to process it, because this was not chaos. This was structure. This was intention. This was a system I had just stepped into without realizing it, and I felt it then, that shift, not fear, not yet, but awareness sharpening into something undeniable, and behind me, his voice came, calm, measured, exactly where I expected it to be even though I had not heard him approach. You opened the only door in this house that matters. And I turned slowly, meeting his gaze, searching for something in his expression that would tell me how to react. But there was nothing there except that same quiet control, and I asked the only question that made sense. What is this? And he stepped forward just enough to stand in the doorway, not blocking me, not forcing anything, just present, and he answered without hesitation. This is the part of my life that does not pretend, and something in the way he said it settled into me deeper than I expected. Because suddenly everything made sense, the silence, the precision, the way people outside seemed to notice more than they showed, and I felt my grip on the moment tighten, not in panic but in realization, and I said quietly, almost to myself, "You are not who you let people see." And for the first time, there was the faintest shift in his expression. Not surprise, not denial, just acknowledgement, and he replied, "No, I am exactly who I am, I just decide who gets to understand it." And standing there, in that room that revealed more than it explained, I realized that whatever I had married into, it was not something small, and it was definitely not something I could walk away from without consequence. The moment you understand the truth, leaving stops being a choice and starts becoming a calculation. I did not move right away. Not because I was frozen, but because my mind was reorganizing everything I thought I knew into something that actually made sense. The quiet house, the careful details, the way nothing felt accidental. And now this, a room that did not belong in a life that pretended to be simple. And I looked at him again, really looked this time, not as the man I had impulsively married, but as someone who had been standing in control of far more than I had allowed myself to see. And the realization settled in slowly, not as fear but as weight, and I stepped back out of the room. Not running, not retreating, just creating distance so I could think clearly. And I said the only thing that felt honest: I should leave. And for the first time, I expected resistance, a shift, something that would confirm what this situation implied. But instead he stepped aside, completely, giving me a clear path down the hallway, his voice steady. "The door is unlocked." And that simple response unsettled me more than anything else, because it removed the tension I had prepared for, replaced it with something harder to define, and I walked past him without another word, down the stairs, each step echoing louder now that I understood where I was, and when I reached the front door, I paused for just a second, my hand resting on the handle, aware that this was the moment where I either stayed inside something I did not fully understand or stepped back into a world that suddenly felt smaller than it had the night before, and I opened the door, stepping out onto the street. The air cooler than it had been earlier, sharper, and for a brief second, everything felt normal again: the sidewalk, the quiet neighborhood, the distant sound of traffic, and I took a few steps forward, letting that sense of normalcy settle in, convincing myself that maybe I had overestimated everything, that maybe this was still something I could walk away from without consequence. But then I noticed it, the same black SUV from the night before, parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted just enough to hide the details but not enough to pretend it was not watching. And I slowed slightly, my eyes scanning the reflection in the glass of a nearby window, catching the outline of movement inside the vehicle, subtle but intentional. And I felt it then, not panic, not fear, but clarity sharpening into something undeniable, because this was not coincidence, this was structure. And I kept walking, testing the distance, moving down the block, my steps steady even as my awareness heightened, and the SUV did not move, not immediately, but I could feel it there, present like a boundary I had just crossed. And after half a block, I stopped, turning slightly, not directly facing it but enough to confirm what I already knew, that I was not invisible anymore, not in the way I had been before, and the realization settled into place with a quiet certainty, that leaving was not about walking out of the house, it was about stepping into a world that now knew I existed. And I stood there for a moment longer, letting that sink in, before turning back, retracing my steps without hesitation, because the decision had already been made the second I understood the difference between freedom and exposure. And when I reached the door again, I did not pause this time. I stepped inside, closing it behind me with a soft click that felt final in a way I had not expected. And he was still there, exactly where I had left him, as if he had known how this would unfold without needing to follow. And I met his gaze, no confusion left now, no illusion of control I did not actually have, just understanding. And I said quietly, "They are not here for you." And he nodded once, as if confirming something we both already understood, and replied, "No," before adding, "They are here because of you now." And that should have scared me, should have made me regret everything that had led to this moment, but instead it clarified something deeper, something that had been forming since the rooftop, that I was no longer standing on the outside of someone else's life. I was inside something that had already begun to reshape mine, and for the first time since I walked away from everything I thought I wanted, I realized that I was not trapped, I was chosen, and that distinction changed everything. Power is not what people show you, it is what everyone else silently agrees not to question. The house did not feel the same after that moment, not because anything had changed physically but because I had, because once you see the structure behind something, you cannot go back to pretending it is simple. And I found myself noticing details I had overlooked before, the way the phone on the kitchen counter never rang yet was always within reach, the way the curtains were never fully open or fully closed, always positioned just enough to see without being seen, and the way he moved through the space like it was not just his home but a system he understood completely. And I did not ask more questions right away, not because I did not have them but because I realized something important, that answers in this world were not given freely, they were revealed through observation, through patience, through understanding how things functioned beneath the surface. And over the next few hours, I began to see it more clearly, not through dramatic moments but through subtle shifts. Like when we stepped outside later that afternoon and walked down the street together. the same quiet neighborhood, the same unremarkable buildings. But now I noticed how people reacted. A man across the street paused mid-conversation, lowering his voice slightly as we passed. A woman pushing a stroller adjusted her path just enough to avoid crossing directly in front of us. Not out of fear, not obviously, but out of awareness, like there was an unspoken understanding that did not need to be explained, and I stayed quiet, letting it unfold, letting myself process what I was seeing without interrupting it with assumptions. And we stopped at a small restaurant on the corner. Nothing expensive, just a simple place with a handwritten menu in the window. And when we stepped inside, the shift was even more noticeable. The owner looked up, recognition flickering across his face before he nodded once, respectful but not exaggerated, and said, "Table is ready." Even though we had not called ahead, even though there were people already waiting, and I felt it then, that quiet rearranging of the environment, not forced, not demanded, just expected, and we sat, and the service was immediate, precise, almost too efficient, and I watched everything, the way no one questioned anything, the way everything adjusted around him without him having to say a word. And when I finally looked at him, really looked, I understood something I had missed before, that his power was not in what he did. It was in what others did in response to him. And I asked quietly, not challenging, just seeking clarity, "How long has this been your life?" And he did not answer right away, just took a sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with the same controlled movement I had come to recognize, and then he said, "Long enough that I do not remember what it was like before." And there was no pride in it, no explanation, just fact, and I nodded slightly, absorbing that, letting it settle into the larger picture that was forming in my mind. And as we left the restaurant, stepping back onto the street, I realized something else, something that shifted the way I saw everything that had happened, that the life I had walked away from, the one filled with visible wealth and obvious status, had been loud, performative, built on appearances that needed constant validation. But this was something entirely different, something quieter, deeper, a kind of control that did not need to prove itself because it was already understood. And as we walked back toward the townhouse, I felt that realization settle into me, not as fear, not as doubt, but as a strange, steady awareness that I had stepped into something far more powerful than I had ever been exposed to before. And for the first time, I did not question whether I had made the right decision. I started to question whether I had ever truly understood what power looked like until now. The truth does not destroy you all at once. It waits until you are strong enough to understand what it means. It did not happen in a single moment, not like everything else that had unfolded so sharply over the past 24 hours, but slowly, piece by piece, like something revealing itself only when I was ready to see it clearly. And it started with something small, something that would have meant nothing before, a name on a document left open on the desk in that hidden room, a detail I had not fully processed the first time, but now it stayed with me, echoing quietly in the back of my mind, a V Holdings, simple, clean, almost forgettable, except it was not, because I had seen it before. Not in this house, not in this life, but somewhere tied to the one I had just left behind, and I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was coincidence, that I was connecting things that did not belong together. But the thought stayed persistent until I found myself going back downstairs later that evening, the house quiet again, the same controlled stillness wrapping around everything, and I stepped into the room without hesitation this time, moving directly to the desk, scanning the documents more carefully, not searching randomly but with intention, and there it was again, clearer now, attached to financial statements, to numbers that were too large to ignore, and I felt that shift inside me, that moment where doubt gives way to understanding, and I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old emails, through archived documents I had not thought about since everything fell apart, until I found it, a message Daniel had sent weeks ago, late at night, vague, frustrated, talking about pressure, about investors pulling out, about a debt he could not explain, and attached to that thread, a name partially hidden, but enough for me to connect it, and I stared at the screen for a long second, my pulse steady but heavier now because the pieces were aligning in a way that made everything else look different, and I turned, already knowing where this was going before I even asked, and he was there, as if he had expected this moment, standing just inside the doorway, watching without interruption, and I held his gaze, no hesitation left now, just clarity sharpened into something direct. "You were behind it?" I said. Not a question, not an accusation, just fact, and he did not deny it, did not deflect, just stepped forward slightly, enough to close the distance without crowding it, and said, "I was involved. And that careful wording only confirmed what I already knew, and I felt something rise in me then. Not anger in the way I expected, but something deeper, something more precise, because this was not random, this was not coincidence, this was design, and I took a breath, steadying myself before speaking again. You knew about Daniel, about the engagement, about everything. And he nodded once, slow, deliberate, yes. And the simplicity of that answer hit harder than anything else, because there was no apology in it, no attempt to soften the truth, just acknowledgement. And I stepped closer, my voice still controlled but sharper now. So you did not just step into my life last night, you were already in it? And for a brief second, the silence between us stretched, not uncomfortable but charged, and then he said something that shifted everything again. I removed a variable that would have broken you. And I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor, because that was how he saw it. Not manipulation, not interference, but correction. And I shook my head slightly, trying to process the scale of it. You forced him to choose her. And he did not hesitate. I gave him a choice he could not afford to refuse. And there it was, the full weight of it, not hidden, not disguised, laid out in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and I felt the final piece settle into place. The realization that the night at the rooftop had not been the beginning of anything, it had been the result of something already in motion. Something I had never seen coming, and I looked at him then, not as a stranger, not even as the man I had married, but as someone who had reached into my life long before I knew his name, and changed its direction completely. And the only thing I could say, the only thing that made sense in that moment, was quiet, steady, and entirely real. You did not save me. And I held his gaze as I finished. You rewrote everything. The difference between control and care is the line you refuse to cross. His words did not feel defensive, they felt certain, like he had already measured every possible reaction I could have and decided none of them would change what had already been done, and that was what unsettled me the most. Not the fact that he had interfered in my life, but the fact that he stood there without apology, without hesitation, as if the outcome justified everything that led to it. And I held his gaze, searching for something that would make this simpler, something I could push against. But there was nothing careless in him, nothing reckless, just that same quiet control that had been there from the beginning. And I felt the tension shift inside me, not dissolving but changing shape, becoming something more focused, and I said slowly, choosing each word with intention. You do not get to decide what breaks me. And for the first time, there was a pause, not long, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that I had stepped into the conversation differently now, and he nodded once, not in agreement but in recognition. No, he said, his voice steady, I decide what I remove before it does. And that distinction landed heavier than I expected, because it reframed everything again, not as control over me, but as control over the variables around me, and I exhaled quietly, my mind moving through it, testing it, trying to find the flaw, and I asked, and what if I wanted to stay? Not with Daniel, not with that life, but with the version of it that had not been altered, the one that could have existed without his involvement, and he did not answer immediately, his eyes holding mine in a way that felt less like pressure and more like clarity, and then he said, you would not have. And there was no arrogance in it, just certainty, and I almost challenged that, almost pushed back, but something stopped me, not agreement, not acceptance, just the realization that I did not have proof to contradict him. Because the truth was, even before everything fell apart, something had already felt wrong, something had already been shifting beneath the surface, and I had ignored it, chosen not to see it, and now he had forced it into the open in a way I could not avoid, and I turned slightly, pacing a step away, needing space not from him but from the weight of the realization settling in, and I spoke again, quieter now but no less direct. You changed the outcome. And he responded just as evenly, I changed the direction. And that difference lingered in the air between us, subtle but significant, because an outcome suggests an end, something final, but a direction suggests movement, possibility, something still unfolding, and I stopped, turning back to face him, my thoughts aligning in a way they had not before, and I realized something then, something that shifted the entire dynamic of what I had been feeling, that for all the control he had exerted over the situation, there was one thing he had not touched, one thing he had not forced, and I said it before I could second-guess it. You never tried to control me. And this time the response came without hesitation. If I needed to, you would not be asking that question. And the simplicity of that statement made everything else fall into place because it was not a threat, it was a fact, delivered without emphasis, without intent to intimidate, just truth. And I stood there for a moment, letting that settle, letting the distinction become clear, that whatever he had done, whatever he had influenced, he had not taken away my ability to choose. Not then, not now, and that realization shifted something fundamental inside me, because it meant that everything that had happened since I walked out of that rooftop, every step, every decision, had still been mine, even if the path itself had been altered, and I met his gaze again, no longer trying to define him as either the problem or the solution, but as something more complex, something that did not fit into either category, and I said quietly, "Then do not cross it." And for the first time since this conversation began, there was a subtle change in his expression, not soft, not yielding, but acknowledging, and he nodded once, "I will not." And in that moment I understood something I had not expected, that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, it was not built on control alone, it was built on lines, and whether or not they held would depend on both of us. Sometimes the past does not come back as a memory. It returns as an answer you were never looking for. I did not expect him to say anything more after that, because the conversation had already crossed into something deeper than either of us had planned, but instead of stepping away or closing the distance, he remained exactly where he was. Like there was still something unfinished, something he had not yet decided whether to say, and I felt it before he spoke, that subtle shift in the air, the kind that only happens when a truth is about to surface, and when he finally did, his voice was quieter than before, not softer, just more precise. "This did not start last night," and I felt my attention sharpen immediately, not surprised, not even confused, just aware that whatever came next would change how I understood everything that had led to this moment, and I held his gaze, waiting, giving him the space to continue without interruption, and he did, but not in the way I expected, not with a long explanation or a detailed confession, just fragments carefully chosen. "3 years ago," he said, and that alone was enough to pull something loose in my memory, something distant, something I had not thought about in a long time, and I frowned slightly, trying to place it, trying to connect it to anything that mattered, but before I could, he added, "Chicago." And the moment he said it, I felt it, that quiet recognition, like a door opening somewhere in the back of my mind, and I saw it again, not clearly at first, just pieces, a street, rain on pavement, the sound of tires stopping too quickly, and then it came into focus, the night I had stayed late after a work trip, the accident I had come across on the edge of an empty intersection, the man sitting on the curb, silent, not injured in a way that drew attention but still not moving, and I had stopped, not because I knew him, not because I had to, but because it felt wrong to walk away, and I had called for help, stayed until the ambulance arrived, even covered the initial hospital cost because he had refused to give his name, and I had never thought about it again after that. It had just been something small, something human, and I looked at him now, really looked, searching his face for confirmation of something I was not sure I wanted to believe, and he nodded once as if answering the question before I could ask it. That was me, and the room seemed to shift around that statement, not physically, but in the way everything connected, because suddenly the timeline stretched further back than I had realized, further than the rooftop, further than Daniel, further than anything I had thought was the beginning, and I felt a slow breath leave my chest as I processed it. "You remembered?" I said, not as an accusation but as a realization, and he did not deny it. "I do not forget variables that matter." And there it was again, that language, that way of seeing the world not in terms of chance but in terms of significance, and I took a step back, not out of fear but because the scale of it required distance, because this was no longer just about interference or control, this was about time, about intention that had existed long before I understood it, and I shook my head slightly, trying to reconcile the simplicity of that moment in Chicago with the complexity of everything that had followed. "It was just a night," I said, quieter now, and he responded just as evenly, "Not to me." And that difference settled into the space between us, heavy and undeniable, because to me it had been a small decision, something instinctive, something I had not assigned meaning to, but to him it had been something else entirely, something that stayed, something that influenced what came after, and I felt the final layer of understanding begin to take shape, not complete yet, but close, and I asked the only question that made sense now. "So this was never random?" And he met my gaze without hesitation. "No." And for the first time since all of this began, I understood that what I had stepped into was not just a consequence of one night. It was the result of a moment I had already lived and forgotten, and somehow, that made it feel less like a mistake and more like something that had been waiting to happen. The moment you realize you were never an accident, everything stops feeling like chaos and starts feeling like choice. I stood there longer than I should have, not because I needed more answers but because I needed time to understand what the answers meant, and for the first time since this all began I was not reacting, I was thinking not about what had happened, not about what he had done, but about what I wanted to do next, and that was new because until now every decision had been driven by disruption, by loss, by the need to regain control over something that had been taken from me. But this was different. This was not about taking anything back. This was about deciding whether I wanted to step forward into something I now understood was never random, and I looked at him again, not searching for justification, not trying to define him as right or wrong, but seeing him clearly for what he was, someone who had the power to alter outcomes, someone who operated in a world that did not rely on chance, and yet had chosen to let me stand here, asking questions, making decisions, and that mattered more than anything else he had revealed. And I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of everything settle into something steady instead of overwhelming, and I said quietly, "You could have forced this, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact," and he did not interrupt, did not deny it, just waited, and I continued. "You could have made sure I never had a choice in any of it." And now there was a slight shift in his gaze, not defensive, not distant, just attentive, and I finished, "But you did not." And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full of understanding, because we both knew what that meant without needing to explain it, and he finally spoke, his voice as controlled as ever but carrying something deeper now, something that was not there before. Because if you had no choice, it would mean nothing. And that was it, that was the line that clarified everything, not what he had done, not how he had done it, but why he had stopped where he did, and I felt something shift inside me then, something that had been forming since the rooftop, since the moment I realized I had been replaced, something that had been searching for direction, and now it had one, and I took a step closer, not hesitating, not questioning, just moving with the same clarity that had carried me this far, and I met his gaze directly, no uncertainty left, no need to test the ground beneath me, because for the first time I understood that I was not standing in someone else's decision, I was standing in my own, and I said it simply, without emphasis, without drama, "Then this is my choice." And the words felt different as soon as they left my mouth, not reactive, not defensive, just real, and he held my gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring the weight of that decision, not to challenge it, not to change it, but to acknowledge it fully, and then he nodded once, and something about that single movement felt more binding than anything that had happened in the courthouse, because this was not legal, this was not impulsive, this was intentional, and I felt the final hesitation fall away, not because everything made sense, but because I no longer needed it to, and I turned slightly, looking around the room again, the maps, the systems, the life that existed beneath the surface, and for the first time, it did not feel like something I had stepped into blindly, it felt like something I was choosing to understand, and when I looked back at him, there was no distance left between who I had been and who I was becoming, just a quiet certainty that whatever this was, it was no longer happening to me, it was happening with me, and that distinction changed everything. The world does not change when you win, it changes when you stop asking for permission to belong in it. A week later, I stood at the edge of another rooftop, not as the planner, not as the invisible presence behind the scenes, but as someone who no longer needed to explain why I was there. And the difference was not in the view or the city or even the people surrounding me. It was in the way the space reacted before I even took a step forward, the subtle shift in attention, the way conversations softened just slightly, the way movement adjusted without anyone needing to say a word, and I felt it. Immediately, that quiet recognition that had once belonged to someone else's world, now settling around me as if it had always been waiting, and beside me, Adrian stood with the same calm presence that had never needed to prove itself. But this time, I was not observing it from a distance, I was part of it, and that distinction carried more weight than anything else that had happened, and as we moved through the crowd, I caught fragments of familiar faces, people who had been at that first rooftop, people who had watched me disappear without question, and now they looked again, but differently, not with curiosity or dismissal, but with something more careful, something measured, and I did not rush, did not seek them out, just allowed the moment to unfold, because for the first time, I understood that presence did not need to be announced. It needed to be recognized, and when I finally saw Vanessa across the room, standing near the same circle of people she had claimed so effortlessly before, I noticed the difference immediately, not in her appearance, not in her posture, but in the way the space around her felt less certain, less anchored, like something had shifted beneath her without her realizing it yet. And our eyes met for a brief second, and there was a flicker there, not fear, not regret, just confusion, like she was trying to understand how I had re-entered a world she thought had already been rewritten without me. And I held her gaze just long enough to let her see it. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity. And then I looked away, because I did not need anything from that moment, not validation, not closure. It had already served its purpose, and further across the room, I saw Daniel. His posture tighter than before. His confidence no longer effortless but constructed. And I realized then that whatever stability he had relied on was no longer holding the same way, not because of anything visible, but because the foundation beneath it had changed, and I felt no satisfaction in that, no desire to confront or expose anything, just a quiet understanding that the version of the future I had once imagined was never as secure as it appeared. And now I was standing in something entirely different, something that did not rely on appearances at all. And as Adrian's hand brushed lightly against mine, not to guide, not to claim, just present, I recognized the significance of that small, controlled contact, not possession, not direction, just acknowledgement, and I let my hand remain there, not because I needed to hold on, but because I chose to, and the night continued around us, conversations resuming, music filling the space, but none of it felt overwhelming or out of reach. It felt aligned, like I had finally stepped into a version of the world that did not require me to prove I belonged. And as I looked out over the city, the lights stretching endlessly beyond the horizon, I understood something that had taken me the entire journey to realize, that I had not lost anything that night on the rooftop. I had been released from something that was never meant to hold me, and now, standing here, not as who I used to be but as who I had chosen to become, I did not feel like I had taken someone else's place. I felt like I had built one that no one could take from me, and that was the kind of power no one had ever taught me to recognize until now.